I just wanted to feel glamorous.
To the world, Kim Kardashian is visibility perfected, luxury, influence, control, a life so documented that it feels impossible for anything to remain hidden. Every outfit analyzed, every relationship dissected, every move turned into content. She represents modern success in its most polished form, where fame, wealth, and relevance seem permanently secured. But total visibility can be deceptive, because when someone allows the world to see everything, it often means the most important parts are happening somewhere else. Away from the cameras, away from the brand, away from the narrative that's been carefully maintained for years. Kim Kardashian didn't just become famous, she became a system built on attention, emotional exposure, and constant reinvention. And systems don't survive on authenticity alone. They survive on control, on calculation, on knowing exactly what to reveal and what to conceal. The unsettling part isn't the fame. It's the cost of sustaining it for decades, because behind the glamour is a life shaped by pressure most people never experience. Pressure to remain desirable, relevant, emotionally available to millions while privately protecting something fragile. And over time, that pressure reshapes identity in ways that aren't obvious, but deeply disturbing once you look closely. This isn't a story about scandal. It's about what prolonged fame does to a person, and why the life Kim Kardashian built may be far darker and far more controlled than it appears on the surface. Long before Kim Kardashian became a global symbol of wealth, influence, and hypervisibility, she was learning something far more valuable than fame. She was learning control. Not control in the loud, domineering sense, but in the quiet, psychological sense. Control over narrative, over perception, over timing, over how much of herself the world was allowed to consume. And most importantly, control over what the world mistook for authenticity. Kim didn't stumble into fame. She studied it. In the early years, she existed on the margins of celebrity culture, close enough to observe, far enough to remain invisible. Stylists, assistants, side characters in someone else's spotlight. While others chased attention recklessly, Kim watched how attention worked, what people rewarded, what they punished, what they forgave, what they never forgot. And she remembered all of it. Reality television became the perfect laboratory, a space where real life could be edited, curated, and paced like fiction, where conflict could be staged but still feel organic, where intimacy could be monetized without ever being fully surrendered. Kim didn't just participate in this environment, she mastered it. From the very beginning, she understood a disturbing truth about modern fame. People don't want truth. They want access, and access can be simulated. So Kim gave the audience just enough vulnerability to feel invited, enough emotion to feel trusted, enough imperfection to feel human, but never enough to lose control. Every tear had context, every confession had framing, every crisis had a camera angle. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic. As the show grew, so did the illusion of openness. Viewers felt like they knew her, like they watched her mature, suffer, love, and rebuild in real time. But what they were actually consuming wasn't her life. It was a version of her life, filtered through brand preservation. That distinction is where things become unsettling, because living as a brand doesn't just affect how others see you, it changes how you see yourself. When every emotional moment is evaluated for impact, authenticity becomes a liability. Raw reactions are dangerous, privacy feels inefficient, and over time the boundary between who you are and who you perform starts to erode. Kim's rise wasn't built on chaos. It was built on consistency. Consistency in aesthetics, consistency in messaging, consistency in desirability. She became predictable in a way that felt comforting to audiences. Even her transformations, relationships, reinventions, controversies followed a rhythm. Rise, backlash, vulnerability, redemption, repeat. The cycle trained viewers to stay invested because the story never truly ended. But cycles have consequences. The longer Kim lived under constant observation, the more calculated her emotional life became. Relationships weren't just personal, they were arcs. Breakups weren't just painful, they were narrative shifts. Even motherhood was introduced with timing, symbolism, and framing that fit the larger story of evolution. This isn't to say the emotions weren't real, it's worse than that. They were real, but managed. And managing your own emotions for public consumption creates a split identity. One part of you feels, the other evaluates how that feeling will be received. Over time, the evaluator gains power. The feeling becomes secondary. That's when a life stops being lived and starts being produced. Kim's public persona emphasized strength, composure, and control. Rarely did she appear overwhelmed for long. Rarely did she lose narrative authority. Even during moments of apparent vulnerability, the message was clear. She survives, she adapts, she wins. The world applauded that resilience. But resilience, when performed constantly, can become armor. And armor is heavy. There's something psychologically disturbing about never being allowed to fall apart without witnesses. About knowing that even your lowest moments will be archived, rewatched, dissected, and monetized. Over time, self-protection becomes obsession. You learn to preempt criticism by anticipating it. You learn to dull pain quickly because pain slows production. Kim became exceptionally good at this. She didn't lash out. She reframed. She didn't retreat. She rebranded. She didn't disappear. She recalibrated. Each response reinforced the same message. She is unbreakable. But the cost of being unbreakable is that you're never allowed to be safe. You're always on display, always assessed, always performing emotional competence, and the audience mistook that for strength. What they didn't see was how identity slowly narrowed, how self-worth became tied to metrics, engagement, relevance, desirability, how aging stopped being natural and became something to manage aggressively, how privacy stopped being a right and became a threat. Because when your success depends on attention, silence feels dangerous. Kim's life became a feedback loop. Visibility created relevance. Relevance created opportunity. Opportunity required more visibility. There was no natural off-ramp, no season of obscurity, no space to reset without risking decline. That's the trap. And it's far more disturbing than scandal, because scandals end. Systems don't. Kim didn't just live in public. She learned to survive because of it. But survival in that environment demands emotional efficiency. You don't process pain deeply, you compartmentalize it, you move on before it destabilizes the brand. Over time, this creates emotional compression. Feelings don't disappear, they flatten, highs feel muted, lows feel rehearsed. Everything exists in a narrow range of acceptable expression. That's why so much of Kim's life feels oddly calm, even during chaos. The tone rarely shifts dramatically. The emotional register stays controlled. This isn't coincidence, it's conditioning. When your livelihood depends on being palatable, you learn to regulate yourself relentlessly. And eventually, you don't know where regulation ends and identity begins. The disturbing truth about Kim Kardashian's rise isn't that she exposed too much of her life. It's that she exposed just enough to make the world believe nothing was hidden, while protecting the core so completely that even she may no longer access it freely. That's the cost of manufactured reality, not loss of privacy, but loss of emotional spontaneity. And once spontaneity is gone, everything that replaces it feels efficient, polished, and deeply hollow. This was only the beginning. By the time Kim Kardashian reached full cultural saturation, something fundamental had shifted in how her life functioned. Fame was no longer a byproduct of what she did. It was the operating system through which everything ran. And that system required constant emotional labor. Not the visible kind, tears, breakdowns, chaos, but the invisible, exhausting work of managing reactions before they happen, of anticipating judgment, of shaping emotions into something digestible, of feeling in ways that remain profitable. This is where the disturbing part deepens. Because when emotional labor becomes permanent, you don't just perform feelings, you optimize them. You learn which emotions increase engagement and which create risk. Vulnerability is allowed, but only in controlled doses. Anger is acceptable if it's framed as empowerment. Sadness is safe if it leads to resilience. Anything messy, unresolved, or contradictory must be shortened, softened, or removed. Kim mastered this balance. She became fluent in emotional presentation, how to cry without unraveling, how to speak about trauma without lingering inside it, how to acknowledge pain while signaling that productivity will continue uninterrupted. The message was always clear: I'm affected, but I'm still functioning, and functioning became the point. This kind of emotional discipline looks admirable from the outside. It reads as strength, but internally, it creates a dangerous expectation that no matter what happens, you must remain composed, coherent, and available, because availability is the currency. Kim's audience didn't just watch her, they expected her, expected updates, explanations, access. They didn't want distance, they wanted continuity. And over time, that expectation trained her nervous system to stay alert, responsive, and managed. There is no true rest in that state. Even moments that should have been private resets, relationships ending, public backlash, identity shifts, became content cycles. There was no space to disappear long enough to feel without framing, to process without editing, to grieve without context. And grief, when unprocessed, doesn't vanish. It compresses. That compression is what makes the life feel unsettling, because nothing explodes, but nothing fully resolves either. Every emotional event is wrapped, summarized, and placed neatly into the narrative arc before it can destabilize the larger system. Kim didn't avoid pain. She scheduled it. And scheduling pain changes how the brain experiences it. It turns emotion into a task rather than a state, something to be completed rather than lived. Over time, this trains emotional detachment, not numbness, but distance. Distance from spontaneity, distance from unpredictability, distance from vulnerability that can't be controlled. This is why so much of her life appears strangely calm, even during moments that would emotionally derail most people. The system doesn't allow derailment. Derailment threatens continuity, and continuity is survival. Relationships under these conditions become complicated. They're not just personal bonds, they're environments. Each partner enters a world where privacy is conditional and conflict has optics. Love exists, but it's constantly sharing space with cameras, commentary, and expectation. That kind of pressure changes behavior. You don't just ask, "How do I feel?" You also ask, "How will this look?" Over time, that question becomes automatic. And when it does, intimacy becomes filtered. Arguments become strategic. Decisions become layered. You're never just reacting, you're editing yourself in real time. That editing prevents emotional freefall, but it also prevents emotional depth. Depth requires risk, and risk isn't allowed in a life built on stability of perception. Kim's ability to remain composed through repeated upheaval wasn't accidental. It was adaptive. A survival skill developed in an environment where emotional chaos would have been punished, not privately, but publicly. The internet doesn't give people time to recover. It demands instant coherence. So she provided it, again and again. But here's the disturbing contradiction. The more composed she appeared, the more the world demanded composure. Her resilience became an expectation. Her calm became a standard, and standards are merciless. They don't adjust when circumstances worsen. When someone is always strong, they stop receiving care. They stop being protected. They stop being allowed to fall. Kim became someone the world assumed would always land on her feet. That assumption erased empathy. If she struggled, it was framed as drama. If she succeeded, it was framed as calculation. There was no neutral reading left. This is the quiet violence of hypervisibility. Not the hate, but the certainty. People were certain they understood her, certain they knew her motives, certain they could interpret her emotional state through curated moments. And certainty is more dangerous than criticism because it closes the door to reconsideration. Kim's emotional life became something people felt entitled to decode. Every facial expression was analyzed. Every pause was interpreted. Every choice was moralized. Living under that microscope trains hyper-awareness. You learn to regulate your tone, your posture, your timing. Over time, you stop reacting naturally and start responding strategically, not because you're fake, but because being natural is unsafe. That's when emotional labor becomes identity. You're no longer managing emotions to protect your life. You're managing emotions as your life. The brand doesn't just sit on top of the person, it seeps inward. It teaches you what's acceptable to feel and what's better handled quietly. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to locate where genuine emotion ends and performance begins. This is why prolonged fame is psychologically destabilizing, even when it looks controlled, especially when it looks controlled. Because chaos is obvious, but over-control looks like success. Kim Kardashian didn't just adapt to fame, she evolved to survive inside it. But evolution isn't always benign. Sometimes it trades depth for durability. Sometimes it replaces spontaneity with strategy. Sometimes it turns emotional life into something efficient, contained, and eerily flat. The disturbing truth isn't that she shared too much. It's that she learned to feel just enough. Enough to connect, enough to remain relevant, enough to never fully collapse. And once that becomes the norm, returning to unfiltered humanity becomes nearly impossible. Because the system doesn't reward it, and the system, by now, was everything. At some point, the system Kim Kardashian built around herself stopped being something she used and became something she lived inside. That distinction matters more than it seems, because systems are efficient, but they're not forgiving. By this stage, Kim's identity was no longer just public, it was infrastructural. Entire teams, industries, and narratives depended on her continued presence, consistency, and relevance. Her life wasn't simply observed, it was synchronized. Timelines, releases, storylines, and brand decisions moved in rhythm with her personal milestones. There was no clean separation between self and structure. And when your identity becomes a structure, there's no obvious exit. Most people experience phases of life privately. They reinvent quietly. They make mistakes without documentation. They disappear when something ends and reemerge when something new begins. Kim never had that luxury. Every transition happened in motion, under scrutiny, with commentary attached. That constant exposure didn't just limit privacy, it limited reflection. Reflection requires slowness. Slowness creates gaps, and gaps invite loss of relevance. So life stayed fast. Even moments that should have forced stillness, public backlash, emotional strain, exhaustion, were absorbed into the system and reframed as resilience. The narrative never paused long enough to allow vulnerability to deepen. Everything moved forward before it could destabilize. That forward motion looks admirable. It's also psychologically dangerous, because when you're never allowed to stop, you never fully process. And unprocessed experience doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It shows up later as detachment, emotional fatigue, or an eerie sense of unreality. This is where the disturbance becomes structural rather than personal. Kim's life didn't just require her to be visible. It required her to be consistent. Consistent in tone, consistent in ambition, consistent in desirability. Aging under these conditions becomes adversarial, not natural, not gradual, something to manage aggressively, publicly, and continuously. Time stops being something you live through and becomes something you negotiate with. Every change is evaluated for optics. Every evolution is measured for alignment, and alignment matters more than truth. Because truth can be inconvenient. It can disrupt the image. It can fracture the continuity people rely on. Kim learned early that people don't react well to inconsistency. They forgive mistakes more easily than unpredictability. So she didn't disappear. She didn't unravel. She adjusted again and again, staying within a narrow band of acceptable transformation. That band slowly became a cage. Not a dramatic one, a comfortable one. The kind that looks luxurious from the outside, but restricts movement inside. A life where every choice is technically voluntary, but the consequences of deviation are so severe that freedom becomes theoretical. This is why stepping away was never simple. To step away would have meant destabilizing not just income, but identity, not just relevance, but structure. When your life is integrated into an attention economy, absence isn't neutral. It's interpreted as decline, failure, or loss of control. So presence becomes mandatory, even when tired, even when depleted, even when disconnected. That's when the self starts to feel abstract. Kim's public persona continued evolving: law, business, motherhood, authority, but the emotional register stayed tightly controlled. There was growth, but little mystery, expansion, but minimal risk. Everything was framed as upward movement, even when the internal experience may not have matched. This creates a profound internal contradiction. On the outside, progress. On the inside, containment. Containment of doubt, containment of grief, containment of questions that don't have marketable answers. Questions like, what happens if I stop being interesting? Who am I without constant response? What parts of me exist that have never been shown and may never be allowed to exist publicly? Those questions are destabilizing in any life. In a life built on visibility, they're existential threats. So they're suppressed, not violently, professionally. This is why so much of Kim's world feels meticulously calm. The chaos is filtered out not because it doesn't exist, but because chaos disrupts trust. And trust, audience trust, is the foundation of the entire system. Audiences need to believe the story is stable, that the protagonist adapts, that the arc continues, even when reality might demand a pause. But stories don't pause. They transition, and transition is safer than stillness. Kim transitioned constantly, from role to role, from image to image, from phase to phase. Each transition gave the illusion of change while preserving the core structure. Viewers felt movement. The system remained intact. But over time, this erodes authenticity. Not because the person becomes fake, but because authenticity requires unpredictability. It requires moments that don't resolve cleanly, emotions that don't land well, choices that don't optimize engagement. Those moments rarely existed, and when they did, they were quickly absorbed, explained, and neutralized. The result is a life that feels oddly sealed. Nothing leaks, nothing surprises. Everything is polished, buffered, and narratively justified. That level of containment isn't natural. It's engineered, and engineering a life has consequences. It narrows emotional range. It limits spontaneity, it replaces instinct with strategy. Eventually, even the person living it may struggle to identify which feelings are theirs and which are responses shaped by years of conditioning. When performance becomes habitual, stepping out of it feels unsafe, not because of external threat, but because the internal compass has been calibrated to visibility. Silence feels wrong. Privacy feels inefficient. Stillness feels like loss. That's the most disturbing part. Not exploitation, not fame, not control, but the disappearance of an off switch. A life where the system never fully powers down, where even rest is optimized, where even healing is scheduled, where even selfhood exists within boundaries defined by audience tolerance. Kim Kardashian didn't lose herself publicly. She preserved herself too efficiently, and when preservation becomes the goal, growth becomes cosmetic. Movement becomes lateral, and the deeper questions, the ones that don't photograph well, remain unanswered, waiting. This is the cost of a life without an exit, and it sets the stage for what happens when the system can no longer absorb everything, when exhaustion accumulates, when relevance inevitably shifts, and when the question can no longer be postponed. What remains when the brand no longer needs you as much as it once did? That's when the story becomes impossible to manage. Every system eventually reaches a point where maintenance becomes heavier than momentum, where continuing requires more effort than beginning ever did. And when a life has been engineered for constant relevance, that moment doesn't arrive as a crash, it arrives as exhaustion. For Kim Kardashian, the most unsettling phase isn't her rise, her controversies, or even her extreme visibility. It's what happens when the machine she built no longer needs novelty, but still demands output. Because systems don't care about fulfillment. They care about continuity. By this stage, Kim no longer needs to shock the world. She needs to remain present. And presence, when sustained for decades, becomes a burden rather than a privilege. There's no adrenaline left, no thrill of discovery, just responsibility to the brand, to the audience, to the infrastructure built around her name. This is where the disturbance turns inward. When your life has been optimized for attention for so long, silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels threatening, not because of external pressure, but because internal identity has been calibrated to response, likes, reactions, relevance, feedback. Remove those and the self feels undefined. That's the part few people talk about. Not burnout, not fame fatigue, but identity dependence. Kim's life trained her nervous system to expect constant engagement, constant awareness, constant evaluation. Even moments of rest are framed, documented, contextualized. There is no true anonymity left, not even internally. Thought itself becomes shaped by presentation. That's when freedom quietly disappears. Not because someone takes it away, but because you no longer know how to exist without structure. The world sees control, but control requires vigilance. And vigilance is exhausting. Over time, emotional range narrows further. You don't feel deeply, not because you're numb, but because deep feeling disrupts function. You become highly capable, highly resilient, highly efficient, and quietly detached. Detached from unpredictability, detached from messiness, detached from parts of yourself that don't serve a purpose. This is why the life feels disturbing, not because it's fake, but because it's over-optimized. Human beings aren't designed to live as systems. We're designed for cycles, intensity and rest, visibility and privacy, expression and silence. Kim's life removed the silence. And silence is where integration happens. Without it, experience doesn't settle. It just stacks. Relationship after relationship, phase after phase, reinvention after reinvention. Always forward, never inward. Because inward doesn't generate metrics. And metrics became the language of worth. Even achievements that look like evolution, business power, authority, respect, exist within the same structure. They don't free her from the system. They reinforce it. Each success raises the stakes of maintaining coherence. Because when you become proof of something, female empowerment, reinvention, dominance, you're no longer allowed to contradict the proof. You can't unravel. You can't doubt publicly. You can't stop without explanation. So the system continues. But systems don't love you back. They extract consistency. They reward endurance. They punish deviation. And eventually, they outgrow the person they were built around. That's the quiet terror behind long-term fame. Not being canceled, but being outpaced. Becoming stable while the culture craves volatility. Becoming familiar while novelty is rewarded. Becoming a foundation while the world chases the next disruption. When that shift happens, no amount of control can fully reverse it. You can adapt, you can pivot, you can reframe, but you can't unbuild time. The disturbing truth about Kim Kardashian's secret life isn't hidden scandals or unseen chaos. It's the psychological cost of never being allowed to disengage, of living without an off-season, of existing in a loop where relevance must be sustained rather than earned. And when relevance becomes maintenance, meaning starts to thin, not disappear, thin. Achievements feel less satisfying, reinventions feel less transformative, success feels quieter, because the system keeps going whether you feel fulfilled or not. That's when the question finally arrives, the one postponed for years. If I stopped tomorrow, who would I be? Not as a brand, not as a symbol, not as content, but as a person outside the frame. That question is more unsettling than any scandal. Because scandals end, systems don't. Kim Kardashian didn't just survive fame, she mastered it. But mastery came with a price most people never see. A life where emotional freedom is constantly negotiated, where identity is maintained rather than discovered, and where stepping away feels more dangerous than staying. That's why her story isn't inspiring in the traditional sense. It's cautionary. Not about ambition, not about money, not about visibility, but about what happens when a human life becomes too efficient to be fully human. And maybe that's the most disturbing truth of all, because Kim Kardashian isn't an exception. She's a preview of where culture is heading, where lives are optimized, emotions are curated, and identity is sustained through constant output, where success is visible, but peace is deferred. So the next time you see perfection on your screen, remember this story. Remember that control isn't the same as freedom, that resilience isn't the same as healing, and that the most polished lives often hide the heaviest psychological costs. If you want more deep, psychological, and brutally honest breakdowns of celebrities, power, fame, and the hidden costs of success, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because the lives we envy the most often carry the warnings we need to hear.